We have yet another episode for you in our Jesuit Historical Tracks series. This time around we have Father Harold Barry to take us through the history of Silveira House, a place that has been associated with many good works, social works, civic works, and such other developmental works in the Society of Jesus in the province of Zimbabwe then, but now in the province of Zimbabwe, Mozambique. So, this is Father Harold Barry. Let us hear what he has to say.
Thank you so much, and welcome to Silveira House, to people who are watching this. We are actually sitting in the room which John Bradburn used to live in, and where he did a lot of his typing, looking out over the valley. Now there's a lot of trees growing up there, but basically in those days you had a complete view right up to Matoko, where he eventually spent the last days of his life. So Silveira House is part of the greater Chishawasha complex, a large area of land. And by the 1950s, the Jesuits, having started the seminary in the 30s, felt they were ready now to start the formation of those people who wanted to join the Jesuits. Up to that time, they refused to welcome locally born people to become Jesuits because they were concerned to start the local clergy.
Right.
But by the mid-1950s, the time had come. And so the decision was made to build a novitiate here in Chishawasha on the Harare side of the valley. And so this building is a purpose-made novitiate. Okay. And where we are seated at the moment was what we call the novices' quarters.
Okay.
And on the far end there were the priests and so on. And it got off to a start in 1958, but not a huge number of people were coming. But a major difficulty was that the politics of this country were hardening.
Right. And
I think people foresaw that it was going to be difficult for people from Zambia, Malawi, and other countries to come to our novitiate, because he was planned to be, at that time, to be an international novitiate.
All right.
And so they decided this just wasn't working. So then a parallel development was that the situation in the townships in the early 1960s was getting quite out of hand.
Right.
The nationalist movement had started, but it had split in I think 1963, and there were people literally attacking one another in the townships. Okay. ZANU and ZAPU, petrol bombing, and all terrible things were happening. And it looked as though the whole thing was going to, the whites kind of reacted and wanted to clamp down completely on the whole thing and arrest the leaders and put them into detention.
Yes.
And so there was a small group of people, of whom Father John Dove, who was the secretary of the Archbishop at the time, was one of the Jesuits involved, said, we really have to do something to provide a space where people can talk about these issues, try to explore concepts of leadership and development and so on. And so this developed into a series of discussion groups in Highfield in 1963. And we had a superior at that time called Terence Corrigan, Father Terence Corrigan, and he was a very he thought big. He had a real kind of vision, and he came up with this idea. I don't know whose original idea it was, but at any rate he approved of it, of taking up this kind of slightly faltering novitiate and giving it to Father Dove to develop a training center or a development training center.
Okay.
And so in 1964, in December, John Dove arrived here but the novitiate had got out. In fact, they took all the furniture, and they took even the chapel benches. They all took them off to Mbebe, which was to be the novitiate for the foreseeable future. And so John arrived in December 1964, virtually with nothing. No money, no furniture, no staff.
This is John Dove.
John Dove. And he really was an extraordinary person. He was clear that he wanted to do something, but he wasn't sure what he was wanting to do. And so gradually throughout 1965 he explored, he talked to all sorts of people. He got a little bit of money from Cardinal Frings in Cologne. I'm not quite sure how that happened. And Father Paul Crane was doing similar kind of work in England, and he also helped to send a bit of money. And one thing and another, they gradually got started in a very small way in 65, 66, 67. First of all with what they called civics groups, which was another name for politics, but we didn't talk about politics, but we didn't describe it as politics, but that's what it was. How do you develop a kind of consciousness and leadership. In fact, John Dove wanted to call the centre, he did call the centre, a leadership and development training centre. We've dropped the word leadership now, but basically it was a leadership, training and development centre. That was the original title. And
the name Silveira House only came later?
The name Silveira House came in the beginning because Silveira was the name of the very first Jesuit who ever came to this part of the world in 1560. He is a Portuguese Jesuit. Gonzalo de Silveira came up from the coast and tried to start a kind of mission here somewhere in the Zoe Valley near the Zambezi. And it didn't last long. He made some initial progress, but jealousy, and we don't quite know the full story. There is a little book coming out about it, but basically it didn't get anywhere, and that whole phase of Jesuits in Zimbabwe had to wait for another 300 years. It's incredible, actually.
Indeed.
It was from 1561 he was killed, his body thrown into the river, and so right up to 1879 when we came again. So that's over 300 years. At any rate, that's where the name Silveira came from. And
so the civics issues.
So the civics was John Dove started with this idea of civics, which was a kind of follow-up from the discussions in the townships. And he had voluntary lecturers, as he called them, and people would come here and so on. And then the trade union people came along and said, what about us? And so he started to get involved. He never seemed to say no to anything. I mean, the trade unionists came along, and he didn't know anything about trade unionism. And this is an interesting fact, because he really did, I think today we sort of want to go and study things. We go off and say, well, I don't know anything about trade union, I better go and study trade union. But he didn't. He just said, well, let's get somebody in to tell us about it. And so they did that. And then the farmers came, I think from Mangwende, first of all. They came and said, Father, we really need help with farming because we're getting so little off the land, so little. So then he kind of went to a lot of research and so on. They came up with a scheme for agricultural cooperatives. I think they started about 1969.
Now, David, do you have any notables among the trade unionists that you remember and the farmers?
Well, in those early days, that's kind of a tough question because Phineas Sithole was one of the people, but I don't think, I don't quite know when he came on board. He was still, he was very active in the 1970s. You see, the trade union movement was divided into 4 congresses. I mean, the government was very clever. Divide and rule. So there were 4 congresses of trade unions, basically attached to each of the political parties. And
this is before independence.
Oh, we're long before independence. And the trade unions were doing their best to kind of train themselves, but there was so much legislation against them being in any way effective.
Right.
We took it up,
Okay.
And we had a flourishing group in Mapuku, the youth group, and Brother Fitz, Francis Fitzsimmons,
All right.
who was here at that time. He came in, I think, 1967, to help John Dove. He was very much involved, very interested in the youth, and he used to do drama, and he'd take them for outings to Great Zimbabwe, to Kariba, and he'd put them all in the back of a small pickup. I don't know, they must have been quite squashed, but anyway, they were very happy to go off somewhere, and they'd go off. And so an important thing to mention is that in 1968, John Dove was invited to a conference on social development in Maseru, and he found himself sitting next to a man called Steber from Germany, from Miserio.
Oh.
And Herr Steber, he's always called Herr Steber, said to John Dove, this is more or less a true story. He said, "Do you want any money?" And John Dove said, "That's the one thing we're lacking, because we've got all these ideas." So Miserio started to take an interest, and they were really generous from the beginning, and so the whole thing expanded. But John was careful. He expanded, as it were, exponentially. Is that the right word? Step by step. And by the time I came in '72, these four were up and running, and they had agricultural groups spread: Mangwendi, Makumbi, Chishawasha. Of course, we had a demonstration plot in Chishawasha.
Yes.
And
for
agriculture. And they were involved in trade unions, Bulawayo, Gweru, and of course the Civics was running the whole time. So, but of course by that time, by 1972, Silveira House was 8 years old, and it was kind of fairly well established, because there had been a point in the halfway through that first 8 years when the consultors of the province, our famous consultors, had kind of asked serious questions about Silveira House. And this is an important point, because the questions they were asking were basically about whether John Dove was abiding by kind of church. Is this the sort of thing the church should be involved in?
Right.
I mean, to put it bluntly, wasn't Silveira House becoming a political centre, or even worse, a Marxist centre? I mean, there were you won't believe the kind of things that were being said, and John was very hurt about that. And even when Father Munyoro interviewed him not long before his death for the 50th anniversary of Silveira House in 2014.
Yes.
And he was asked about the 60s. He forgot many of the details, but he never forgot the fact that the Jesuits
did not trust him.
That was the thing that irked him very much, that he wasn't trusted by his fellow Jesuits, and he slightly distanced himself from the Jesuits. He was, for example, he was never on any consultation, or he kind of isolated himself a little bit. And I think this is an important point. It's obviously not right, and we shouldn't isolate ourselves. But sometimes Jesuits, even Ted Rogers, in a sense, kind of pulled away from the society in order to get on with these things, because it's difficult to bring the whole province with you.
To agree.
And it's difficult to build up a team.
Sure.
So this is one of the experiences that he had, and he always used to quote Paul Crane, who said to him on one occasion, "John, get your own dough and they'll leave you alone." In other words, if you get your own finance to run this place, the province won't interfere with you. But was the which is not a very, not a very healthy kind of thing in a way. But the province, the superiors of the mission, it wasn't a province at the time, but the superiors, I don't think they quite understood what he was doing. And they were listening to these people at St. George's saying, "What the hell is Silveira House doing? Here we are with our young boys going off into the bush fighting the terrorists and
so
all
to
that.
speak, yeah.
And Silveira House is
Yes.
is kind of promoting the other side.
Mm.
So there was a little bit of misunderstanding, and I think the Jesuits were a bit divided during the whole of that period. We have to admit that.
Yes.
We were not. Maybe the Jesuits in El Salvador were more united, but I think we were a bit divided.
Can we safely say that on the continent, the African continent, Silveira House would have been ahead of
Well, it was certainly ahead of GC32.
Right.
Because GC32 was our great moment when we took up the whole question of the promotion of the faith.
Right.
Involves the promotion of justice
as well.
They're just linked together.
Yes.
Faith, you can't have faith without justice.
Yeah.
And you can't really have justice without faith, because if you just go for the social justice without having a world view of faith,
right.
then it dries up in the sand.
Sure.
So that was that was 74, JC32, but we had started 10 years earlier. So if you like, we were a bit ahead of our time.
Yeah.
But Arupe was very supportive. Arupe was always supporting John Doe. We used to get letters from Arupe.
This is the Superior General then.
Superior General at the time. Anyway, by 1970, well, by the time I came in 72, 73, the place was well established. There was no threat. There was nobody was going to close it, or nobody was going to take it back as a novitiate, or anything. Out of the question. So, and Miserio kept moving, and they kept donating more and more money. We built the whole there's a block there, and there's a whole lot of blocks at the far end over here. Yes. All of that was done by Miserio in 1974, 75. A lot of development. Right. So, while the war was raging, we were continuing our work. And it was difficult, but Fidelis Mukonori was here. He was a brother in those days, and he was very active in the whole youth movement, and he developed the youth movement that had been started by Mana, and the Mavuku thing, and he just took it and lifted it and developed it, and we got budgets for employing a whole lot of youth trainers, we used to call them, or promoters. Yes. And we developed a whole thing. But a lot of these youth had to tread carefully in the rural areas, because the guerrillas, the freedom fighters, had taken over large areas of the rural areas. So some of these guys were in danger of getting caught. They could be accused by either side. You see, it was very difficult in the rural areas in those days. You could easily be suspected by either side. You know, they might think you're an informer, or you're a terrorist, or you're I don't know. Yeah. So he had a very it was a tricky time, and I remember there was one guy who was one of the youth trainers in Marewa. Yes. We used to get them to write monthly reports about their activities, and then we'd sit and evaluate them and talk about them and so on. Yes. And this guy came back. Whenever I see him, I remind him of it, because he ended one of his monthly reports by saying, "There is some danger of my disappearing." Signed Xavier, what's his name? Xavier Makwangura. I don't know if you know Makwangura. Anyway, he wrote, "There's some danger of my disappearing," by which he meant that he felt under threat, and they were working under threat, a lot of them. Sure. But anyway, we carried on with the youth, the agriculture, the trade union, and of course the civics. And Mugabe himself came here in 1974 when he came out of prison. He's held several meetings here. I remember attending them. You could hear a pin drop when he was talking, because he was so focused about the whole. It was incredibly impressive the way he was speaking at that time. And of course we had Muzerewa coming here, Nkomo not so much. Yes. Sitole came here. So there was a lot of Dabaningi Sitole. And there was a lot of sort of coming and going and so on. Yes. So anyway, as you know, the war ground on 75, 76, 77, And then we had people killed. Some of our Jesuits were killed in 77 in Musami, and others were killed in 78 in Magondi and Kangaire. And of course Gussie Donovan's body was never found in Mukumbi. So we were living in tension, you know. But we were here. Sometimes the guerrillas would come, but not so often, because this is too close to Harare.
Right.
In places like St. Ignatius, they would come, and of course Musami, the guerrillas were coming in and so on. But not so much here. I remember we did have once or twice. Yeah. Any rate, so that was the thing. Then
independence came?
Then independence came, 1980, and we all went to Rufaro Stadium and saw the flag being raised. And it was very exciting, you know.
Sure.
And the one slightly sad thing was that there was no wind that night, so we couldn't see the flag. It just went up limp,
right.
You know. And I thought, gosh, is that symbolic about something? I don't know. It's a bit sensitive. At any rate, next morning Mugabe went to mass in the cathedral to give thanks and so on, and then he had to rush off. I remember to escort Prince Charles to the airport because Prince Charles had come out to lower the British flag.
Right.
The governing party, they channeled huge sums to this place because they knew we were trying to help as best we could.
Yes.
So they would, a lot of donor agencies and foreign governments came in, like the Danes and the Norwegians and the Germans and the Belgians. Lots and lots of people came in to help Zimbabwe in 1980. And money was just flowing in. And so we got quite a lot of money for our agricultural scheme because that was seen as being successful. I think we were not alert to one of the two fundamental weaknesses in our scheme. The first one was that it was based on what we call inorganic fertilizer, which takes a lot out of the soil. So it's not sustainable if you just use chemicals the whole time. And we didn't know that in the 70s, believe it or not. It's incredible we didn't know that, but we didn't know it. At least we didn't operate as if we knew it. So that was a weakness, because you cannot go on taking from the soil without putting something back. And the inorganic fertilizer was not good enough for it was tiring out the soil. The second weakness was that we weren't able to handle the large sums that they channeled in our direction. Our scheme was based on a kind of close supervision, so that if I lend you money and you go and buy seed and fertilizer and you put in your crop, then we supervised the payback at the end of the year, because you marketed through, not exactly through us, but through our agents, well, really through us, and we monitored the loan, and we monitored the sales, and we deducted from the sales, and then we gave the farmer whatever. And I mean, it was completely transparent and clear, and there was no corruption or anything. But the trouble is, we were managing it ourselves, and we were not really getting these Mushandra Pamwe groups, the cooperative groups, to manage their own affairs. And obviously we intended to do that, but we hadn't got round to doing it by the time of independence. And so suddenly you have huge amounts of money and low supervision. So guess what happened? The loans were not repaid. And so the money just disappeared. And we realized that this it was a huge, the money was big, and the money out was enormous, and we were not getting it back. And so by 1985, we were really, things were really in a bad situation. See, so independence kind of had that effect, if you like. And a similar thing happened with the trade unions. The ICFTU, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, gave us money for increasing our staff. We employed 6 more people in Masvingo, Bulawayo, Chinhoyi, I don't know, 6 places, Mutare.
Yes.
And we were training all this thing, and it was a great big thing. And then suddenly the ICFTU, after 3 years, they said, sorry, we're finished now. And we couldn't help feeling it was just because Zimbabwe was the darling of the international community in 1980, the sort of newest member of the world community, if you like.
Yes.
And everybody was rushing to give us things. But then after, when the honeymoon was over, they sort of withdrew. So we had to lay off people, and I don't know how good we were in labor relations at that time. We're much better now, but I'm not sure how great we were. So these people were suddenly told, sorry, there's no more money. Your contract is over. And I don't even know if they had a contract.
Right.
So it was a messy kind of thing. And then the youth, that also kind of ran down a bit. Fidelis left to do theology and so on. There wasn't a kind of strong hand. I don't know how it sort of fell apart a bit. Although Francis Chirunga was in charge for quite some time, but then he got ill and one thing and another. And that leaves the civics, which gradually morphed into various things. First of all, there was the research department, which came in. I left in '88 after 15 years here. I left in '88, and after I left, Roland von Nidder was in charge, and they gradually developed the research department and the whole idea of advocacy and peace building. But that was gradual over a period up to about 2000. And then they kept on responding. This was one of the things about Silveira House. It's always kind of responding to needs.
To the needs of the time.
It wasn't like somebody having a strategic plan and doing a sort of an analysis of what are the needs in the country from scratch and from theory. But we were kind of responding to people who. And one of the requests came from Binga, from the Tonga people, so they went there thinking that they would be asking for agriculture and youth and stuff like that. And in fact,
Instead, they were asking.
Instead, they were asking for try and save our language. We want our language is disappearing. The Ndebele's are kind of sort of.
Swallowing them up?
Kind of swallowing them up in some way. And I heard stories of people going to register their children, and they'd register their children. Of course, the parents would come along. The parents were illiterate, and they wouldn't know what the guy was writing down. And in fact, he wrote down an Ndebele name for your child, who's a Tonga child. That sort of thing happened occasionally. I don't know if it's widespread or anything like that. But at any rate, that sort of thing happened. And so the Tonga were asking for to save our language, you see. So then we started a whole program on that, which was very, very successful. Isaac Mbande he's still here. He was very much involved in that. By the way, I've left out things. I've left out important things. 2 important things. One is what we call appropriate technology, which was developed in the early 80s with Father Brian McGarry. He did a lot of work kind of researching and trying to set up schemes and programs. He had all sorts of little schemes that he was developing at that time.
And this issue about the Blair toilets, is it?
The Blair toilets is another one, thank you. Yeah, that's another one. He was promoting, although the Blair toilets were being promoted by another organization in Dombashawa. It was the whole thing. The other important thing which I failed to mention was that Sabina Mugabe, Robert's sister, came on staff in the mid-70s. She didn't use the name Mugabe, she used the name João. And she developed a whole program for women, nutrition, childcare and so on. And at one point her sister Bridget came on staff as well. And actually they were on staff after independence as well. It was kind of slightly surprising.
Yes.
Sabina became a member of parliament and so on. But that was another thing. Childcare and nutrition was another scheme that we had. But just to keep moving, I don't know how much time we've got. To keep moving, in the 1990s, we had a Jesuit called Peter Balais,
Right.
who was behind the whole program of research and producing a lot of little booklets. We had a whole lot of small books on
Silveira House
long
series.
series, about 25 volumes came out. Various authors, McGarry did one or two, and so that went right through. When I came back for the second time, this is my third time, I came back for the second time in 2002, all of these things were up and running, the research and the advocacy and the peace building. The peace building was later on trying to, because there was a kind of rivalry, MDC and ZANU-PF, and there was a lot of areas of the country where there was friction and killings and so on. So we tried to contribute somehow on that as well. So all that was quite active at that time. But Silveira House was slightly running down in the first decade of this century because funding, although Miserio has been totally faithful right from the beginning up to today, but other sources of funding, and even Miserio themselves, were pulling back a little bit. They didn't have the funds and so on. So we've had to downsize, and we had an awful, painful period of having to lay off staff in the early part of the last decade. And when I was on again in the second time, towards the end of the last decade, I spent a lot of time trying to sort out labour problems. It was very, very difficult and rather unpleasant. But at any rate, I hope we've learned something from all that. There was a time when we had 150 on staff, and we had something like 50 vehicles. Some of them were motorbikes, but we had 50. You know, when you went into the license office, you had to register about 50 vehicles at one point. But now it's sort of way down. I mean, I don't know how many people are employed here, maybe 20 or something. And so
150 to 20.
Yeah, and it's obviously the present administration is very restricted in funds and so on, and there are all sorts of challenges that they keep facing. But I also feel that in some ways, when you downsize, you become more focused.
Certainly.
You sort of, you know, you sort of say to yourself, now what is the most important thing to do? And I think they're addressing at the moment, I think they're sort of really looking at key areas of I mean, it's basically a continuation of the long history of peace building and civics education, but it's kind of, if you like, more focused in a kind of slightly more, narrower kind of way. So.
But all along, David, Silveira House has always had a spiritual component to it.
I'd like to just say a word about that. I always felt a little bit uncomfortable when Father Dove used to talk about a spiritual component, as if somehow, you know, if you can get people to come to Mass, and at one point we used to have benediction on a Sunday. Now you have these trade unionists who don't know what benediction is, leave alone what the Catholic Church is. You know, they come. We don't ask them if you're Catholic or you're Christian. They come here and then you march them into the chapel for benediction. It doesn't. I felt in some ways that the Christian, the spiritual component, from my point of view, Silveira House, was the very work that we were doing.
Oh, interesting.
That you know, you don't kind of sort of say, right, now we're doing trade unionism, and now we're doing spirituality or the Mass. Everything should. I mean, it's the way we do things, the people we are, and so on, is part of our message. Like that guy this morning who was giving a talk about when he first went to St. Ignatius after independence, and he found that the bus was driven by a white man or white priest, and then his food was cooked by a white woman, as Sister Stephana. He made that point, that in a sense it's not, you don't have to have a spiritual component on top of that, it's what you actually do and how you actually approach people and how you serve people and so on. That I think is the spiritual component itself. You know, but anyway, you probably also, if you can, you should also have retreats. So we did have retreats for our staff every year, and we did have, we did try to put on staff masses. We still do that, and so on. But I don't see those as kind of icing on the cake.
Right.
They're
it's
not icing on the cake. They're part and parcel of a whole sort of approach that one has.
Perhaps I was coming from the point of view of welcoming people who would not necessarily be connected to the works of Silveira House, like in the appropriate technology, agriculture, but parishioners coming, or groups of people from parishes coming in for weekend retreats and things like that.
Yeah.
Perhaps
that's right. They would all take part. You see, people came for all sorts of reasons. They came for retreats, parish retreats, and so on. They came for leadership training. They came for if you have a parish council and you want to discover how to run a parish council, you can come here, and we do our best to provide some kind of training and so on. So really, we tried to do the broad spectrum of various, whatever was really, whatever the people themselves wanted, you know. I think that was kind of, and when I wrote my little book, whatever it is, 15 years ago, celebrating the 40th anniversary of Silveira House in 2004, I called it Knocks on the Door, because that was John Dove's great phrase, that he said, people say, how did you manage to start Silveira House? And John would say, well, I answered knocks on the door. Somebody came and knocked, asked for something, then I started a program.
Now, this is your third stint, as you say, your third time here. What are your wishes for Silveira House?
Well, first of all, I wish Moyo great success. I think it's a difficult task that he's got. The plant is falling to bits. If you look around a little bit carefully, you'll see that. And we're struggling even with our geysers and water systems, and we keep looking, so have we got enough money to repair even the most simple things in our, we just don't have, there's no money here at the moment. And so if something goes wrong, you don't have the money to repair it at the moment. So I told you about money flooding in 1980. Now money is flooding out. So there's nothing to flow really. But to answer your question, I think my hope for this centre is that it will find a way of responding to the new Zimbabwe, which I see emerging at the moment, because there's a whole generation of people who are rearing to go. They're really at the starting line. They want to go, but they're blocked by the present economic, political situation in the country. They can't get moving. They're qualified and they're energetic, they're motivated, but they can't get going. So if we can manage to get to the starting line and sort of get going on this thing, then I think that Silveira House will be able to again contribute in terms of helping in the leadership thing, in sort of looking at whole questions about motivation, because you see the gospel message is the message of service, not really of leadership. Or at least if it's leadership, it's the servant leadership. You know, that you lead through serving, not by dominating. So I think we have a task to kind of help people to kind of understand that the real leader is someone who is with the people in some way and develop it. Now that only comes about through a kind of spiritual conversion.
Right.
And that's where I think the retreat side comes in. And I would like to look into the future and see a greater kind of integration between the if you want, spiritual side and the development side, and that they become one in some way. And that we manage to raise the level of our plant. Nobody wants to send to do a course at Silveira House. Not even the Jesuits want to come here because the place is falling down. But if we could sort of lift up the standard a little bit, and maybe, you know, people nowadays want en-suite, whereas people say en-suite. But anyway, they want you know, all they want self-contained units. So if we could do that and have a nice conference center, like we had, we went that day to the place there.
That's right.
I was looking around that and I was saying to this is a training center here in
Mana Resorts.
In Mana, and I was saying to this is very beautiful, but it's not that expensive to set it up. The buildings are not that flashy. They're quite simple, and what was beautiful about it was the lawns and the paths. Anyway, that would be my vision for the future. That there's a sort of an integration of the whole idea of leadership and service and based on the gospel. And I think people are ready for that. You know, I think people are obviously disappointed that after nearly 40 years, independence hasn't delivered the kind of quality of life that they hoped for. But there's no. But it will come. It will come. But you have to kind of, I mean, I come from Ireland. When we got independence in 1922, we had a long period of poverty in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And we also had a civil war. Well, we haven't had a civil war here, but they had a short civil war. I mean, like the Gukuru, not really like Gukuru. Anyway. So, but it was only in the 60s, independence in 1922, only in the 60s could you begin to say the country was getting on its feet. So I you know, you tend to take a little bit of a long view. People have to have room to make mistakes, and then learn from
those mistakes. That's right. That's the important thing. So anyway, thank you very much, David. I think that was very insightful. I mean, there are things that you've said there which I wasn't aware of, especially about the beginnings of Silveira House and the objectives of this center that were responding to the needs of the time. So
I think if I could just add one quick thing, I think you know, everybody praises John Dove, and rightly so, because he did have an extraordinary sense of vision. I don't know where he got it from, because all his training, I mean, he had no training. He never had a degree, never did a degree in his life. No, leave alone doctorates or anything like that. Completely, his only training was in the British Army during the war. Maybe you might say that was training good enough to go through a war. But he had a real ability to listen and to empower people to do things. You know, that was a beautiful thing, and he had a wonderful way of welcoming people. I mean, donors as well as ordinary people. So everybody came here, and everybody was welcomed. And he'd sit them down. Would you have a brandy? You know, people were welcomed, and I think that they felt at home, and I think that encouraged me. But anyway, I should stop.
No, that's all right. No, thank you. Like I said, thank you very much, David, and I'm sure our followers, our friends, our collaborators, even fellow Jesuits have learnt a good deal from this conversation. Lest we lose it, we need to keep these kinds of conversations going on for our own development and our well-being as well, and of course for understanding our history here in the country as a province. Okay, thank you, David.
Very good.